I grew up in Castlebar, and I was running through Tullamore this morning and saying, what a beautiful town. It really reminded me of my own youth on Rathbone Road with Pádraig O'Toole. Back then, everything was simple. We used to run out to DC's farm and knock down haystacks. We used to catch trout in the local river. We could go to the local woods and pick hazelnuts, blackberries. In fact, I remember fruit salad being an exotic dish that you felt guilty eating. But there were a lot of things I didn't know back then. I didn't know that there were about 3 billion people in the world. I didn't know that every breath I took, there were about 313 parts per million of carbon. I didn't know that the first indications of an increase in temperature were being detected by scientists. I didn't know that IBM had built a computer in the States that could hold 1 megabyte of memory and it weighed 1 ton. I didn't know that this beautiful ecosystem existed about 100 miles to the west of Castlebar on the Atlantic Break, a vulnerable marine ecosystem of cold-water corals. I didn't know these fish were there. And it was many years later, I was in the Navy, and I was inspecting some nets from a Spanish trawler. And in that net, I found bycatch of coral, cold-water coral. And a few years later, I did my PhD with Lawrence Judah in the War College in the US and Tim Hennessy from Rhode Island University. And I specialized in this area. And this is one of the richest vulnerable marine ecosystems on the planet. And it's all along the west coast of Ireland. And you know who owns it? You do. You own this vulnerable marine ecosystem, and you own these fish. And that was the question I asked in my PhD, who owns biodiversity? Because when you don't value something and you don't know you own it, that ownership is more imaginary than real. And where is it now? Well, these individual fish, some of them are over 200 years of age. They were swimming when Darwin was on the Beagle, reflecting on natural selection and the evolution of mankind. And they're gone. Government subsidized the fisheries for deep water trawling. The foot rope called the Rockall Happer was hundreds of weight in depth and in weight. And the manual to catch these fish said, you land the net on top of the seamount and you drive hard ahead and scoop up the fish and follow the curve of the seamount and you'll get to shoal. And they did that. And the fish is more or less extinct right now. But there's more to it. This cold water coral reef, which is a natural carbon sink, in that there are living elements of polyps that take the carbon out of the ocean and they turn it into stone in terms of carbon itself. It took 8,000 years for this reef to form, and it was destroyed in less than 3 minutes. So I tell this story just to give a sense of what's been happening over the last 100 years in our biosphere, in our cryosphere, in terms of the Arctic and Antarctic, in our lithosphere, in terms of our tropical rainforests and our land, in our atmosphere, where we now have nearly 420 parts per million of carbon, and in our ocean, where it's growing in acidic because of the absorption of carbon. And there are 3 drivers of climate change. And the main driver, one of those, is people, in terms of fossil fuel, in terms of the destruction of our ecosystem and our biodiversity, but also in terms of people and the mix we have in terms of our desire for protein and our interplay with animals. We are addicted to fossil fuel, and we can see, as Minister Ryan has said, the implications of that in the context of regional security. We can see how that has played out in terms of the war in Ukraine. And we can see the desire of Europe for strategic autonomy. You cannot have strategic autonomy unless you have self-sufficiency in energy. Fossil fuel means that today we are burning so much fuel that there are 40 billion tons entering the atmosphere in terms of carbon, and that is increasing. It is not reducing. And this CO2 traps the heat from the sun, and that's the reason we have a temperature rise. As I said, we're nearly at 420 parts per million now, as opposed to my 313. And the IPCC in 2014 issued their assessment report, and again updated in 2021 with a much more bleak report, which give us 5 scenarios, the best of which, that if we play our cards right, we could reach 1.5 degrees and arrest it there. But I'm afraid we're on target for 2.7 degrees as we speak, and maybe worse. And the future is looking potentially catastrophic. There is an interplay between people and extinction. Over the last thousands of years, people formed 1% of the weight in vertebrates in the world, and wild animals 99%. Today, people are 32% of that weight, and the animals they keep to feed themselves are 67%. That's a total of 99%, and there's 1% wild animals. By 2050, 10% of the world will be in its natural state, and 80% of our oceans will be acidic and will have increased in warmth. No action is going to be catastrophic. No action will see ocean sea levels rise. Service, the Dublin company, have predicted that by 2100, 8,500 buildings in Dublin will be affected by a 1.7 metre rise in sea level. We will see violent weather events. We will see extreme heat. Today in India, 1 billion people are experiencing 38 degrees centigrade heat. In New Delhi, when I was researching just for this talk, the temperature was 44 degrees over the last number of days. We'll see climate fires, and we've already seen climate fires in Australia, in the west coast of the States, and in fact, just last year, in our own Killarney National Park. And we'll see biodiversity destruction. We'll see food insecurity. And in fact, as we speak, Putin is playing on this point by holding hostage to nearly 32% of the world's wheat. So when we look at it in the context of where we stand, we have 5 main risks identified by Bloomberg, and you can see where climate crisis has come from and the failure from action from number 5 in 2018 to number 1 today. And this is only going to deteriorate further unless the leadership like we have in this room takes action. And number 2 is extreme weather. Number 3 is biodiversity loss. Number 4 is social cohesion erosion, all linked to climate change and climate risk. So the challenge is there for us all to look and see what we can do, because the evidence is quite clear. We've already had extinction of multiple species. In fact, the rate of extinction of wild animals is 100 times more than it would be if anthropogenic activity was not there, if man was not there. And that acceleration goes, and it puts in its crosshairs now the last vertebrate in risk, and that's people. And the jury is out. There is a high probability of extinction of human beings unless we act. Over the last 500 million years, there have been 5 major extinction events. In the last 2, in particular, reptiles and dinosaurs, they didn't know they were about to become extinct. They weren't responsible. And even if they did know, they could do nothing about it. Well, we do know. We are responsible. And the one extraordinary thing is that we have an extraordinary intelligence. We have the capacity to make a difference. We have this ability to use technology. I mentioned that computer that IBM had that had 1 megabyte of memory in it. It would mean that phone today would weigh 26,000 tons. We have automation, robotics, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, intelligence augmentation, virtual reality. We've moved from a situation where in 2010 we had 2 zettabytes of data in the world. We now have 185 zettabytes in data in the world. Every day, new technologies and new ways of doing things are being generated. And we can arrest this climate change, and we can reverse many of the negative tipping points we've already approached. If we look at carbon like a sink, and there's a natural flow into that sink, and it's coming from the natural order, but the perverse piece is the unnatural flow, largely by fossil fuels. And if we can arrest that flow from fossil fuels, if we can stop that, then we can actually start taking charge in terms of the threat to our climate. And we can do just that. We can do it through solar, which is already there. Ireland isn't perfectly suited, But we can certainly do it in wind. And I was really thrilled to come here tonight, or last night, and drive by one of the finest wind turbine farms in the country. And it's a credit to Bord na Mór and their own vision and development that side. But we can also do it in terms of offshore. Ireland has the richest offshore renewable environment probably on the planet. Certainly the richest accessible. And in terms of wind, in terms of the government's plan, as Minister Ryan mentioned, 5 gigawatts by 2030, 30 gigawatts plus, we can actually go to probably 100 gigawatts. And with Supernode and AirGrid and a real smart, I suppose, interplay, Ireland can become the battery of Europe. And it's not just in terms of floating wind and fixed wind, it's also a new generation in terms of wave. I was in Stockholm recently looking at wave energy devices. They're coming back. They were oversold in the past, but I'm certain they will be on the agenda into the future. And new wind turbines will be 15, 25 megawatts the size of the Eiffel Tower. And our jurisdiction is fit and ripe for those. But we can also look at the waste and how we remove carbon from that environment. And the natural waste in terms of restoration of salt marshes, in terms of making sure that we look after those, our natural bogs, and also in the context of seagrass. 1 square kilometre of seagrass in terms of carbon absorption is 35 times greater than that of a rainforest. But on the other side, we can also look at the technology that's available to us. The IPCC have pointed out we need everything. And while in the past the question of carbon capture to some way was dismissed, the technology is here and it's now. And I was in Iceland just 2 weeks ago with Climeworks, who've just taken an investment of $650 million. And they have a plant, probably one of the largest in the world, taking 4,000 tons of carbon at the moment. And as the price of carbon rises and the cost of removal rises, that will become viable. There's huge opportunity for enterprise and companies to move in that direction. And when you remove the carbon, you can store it, or you can turn it into stone, just like my cold water ecosystem. And that's what Carbfix are doing it. They're pumping it into basalt. And I'm sure similar technologies will be available here in Ireland. So removal, sequestration, and of course then you can use your surplus electrons from your offshore renewables to generate green hydrogen and charge that with surplus carbon to generate methane and other fuels that will power our aircraft. So the future is there in terms of technology. But technology is not the problem. The problem is people. People and institutions, and the ability to collaborate and work together in an ecosystem governance piece. We need a good government and we need a policy, but we need it to be resourced. We need Planola to be resourced. We need the Marine Area Regulatory Authority to be resourced. We need National Parks and Wildlife to be resourced. And developers need that proof of life in terms of resourcing, in terms of government policy and officials. But of course we need a market. And the market doesn't always tell the ecological truth. So we need to ensure that civil society and citizens and our values feed into that, and that triple helix that will give us that wonderful ecosystem governance that will make this planet something that is viable for us all to live in. The norms and principles that will define this will be about subsidiarity, about transparency, about clear rules, about good science. But most of all, it will be about leadership. And that's why you're gathered here. Ibsen said leadership is like a community. And in a community, everybody should be willing to take the helm. And Mary Parker Follett said, leadership is not so much about the exercise of power, but the capacity to create that sense of power in those who are led. The real role of a leader is to make more leaders. Thank you very much.